Hello, everyone, and welcome to the One Open Door podcast. My name is David McKay. This is a place for talks and conversations about Zen awareness practice and about how to live that practice right here, right now, in this very world we live in. I hope you enjoy the experience. As always, I'll say that if you are someone who would be interested in receiving support for your own practice, there are a lot of ways to do that through the organization that I facilitate. There is meditation happening a couple times now, every morning. It's happening from 7 to 8 Eastern and from 10 to 10:30 Eastern every day, except on the weekends. The weekends is just from 8 to 9. And it's set up so that people can drop in for as little or as much as they want to participate in with that. We start off with a recitation that's sort of a summation of the Buddhist teachings, and we end with some kind of reading that I offer that I feel like will be inspirational or helpful or both. There are groups on Thursday and Sunday evenings at this point, 7 to 8:30 Eastern Time. We start off with a half-hour meditation, and then we have an hour-long facilitated discussion, and then a lot of other stuff that's more occasional. There are practice days, online classes, and retreats and workshops. Right now, we have a retreat. It's our first in-person retreat since the pandemic began, happening October 25 through 31 here in Western North Carolina at a beautiful retreat center. So if you're interested in any of those things, let me know. If you want more information, you can find it online, www.theoneopendoor.org. And yeah, let me know. I'd love to see you. I'd love to get to know you, and I'd love to practice with you if that's something that you want. Okay, so on with the program. And before I launch into the topic for the day, just a note: if you hear a steady kind of background noise that sounds a little bit like white noise, that's the creek. Today, I'm recording this in the middle of the day today, and I needed a shady spot. And there's some beautiful deep shade up above the creek. The creek is, maybe 40 or 40 feet below me, so it's at a distance, but I think you can probably hear it. So hopefully that's soothing to you rather than annoying. So if you have any feedback, as always, about that or anything else, let me know. Okay, so here is the question for the day. Is conditioned mind a real thing? Is conditioned mind a real thing? And I will tell you why I am asking that question of myself and why I want to talk with you about it. The reason is because I get a lot of comments about that, a lot of confusion, objections, and resistance even to the notion that conditioned mind is a real thing. Why do people get the idea that I think conditioned mind is a real thing? Well, it's because of the language that I use. And that's what I really a piece of what I want to talk about today. The language that I use tends to imply agency. So I'll say stuff, and I don't always do this. There's two different ways of talking about conditioned mind, and I'll get into that in a minute. But one way of talking about conditioned mind is as an entity, kind of like it's an independent thing, like a person with its own intelligence and with a will and some kind of an agenda. And so in this case, the agenda is to cause us to suffering, to cause us to be unhappy, that sort of thing. So I'll say stuff like conditioned mind wants that, or it's doing that, or it doesn't like that. So it speaking of it as if it's a person. And when people run into that kind of language, they struggle with that. Because what they hear is, now, are you saying that there is this entity that's a real thing inside my mind, like the devil that's talking to me? That's what I want to look at today. Is that what it is? And so let's unpack that together. So before we do that, let's just come up with a definition of conditioned mind, just so we know what the heck we're talking about. So conditioned mind, to me, to say it really succinctly, is the set of beliefs and assumptions about who we are, how we are, about how the world is, and so on. Or we might say the set of unconscious processes, so the processes that are going on in our mind that we are not aware of, that create and maintain the illusion of a self that is separate from life. And when I use that word life, as most of you know probably, I mean life with a capital L. We could also use words like God, reality, divinity, spirit, the mystery, things like that. It's just a word to describe or to depict, point at just the thing don't really understand and can't talk about, but the thing that is the essence of everything and is causing everything to happen. So the way that we suffer is that we become lost, we disappear into a self, an illusory self that has positioned itself outside of life with its own will, with its own preferences and opinions and that kind of stuff that it believes in. That's what causes our suffering. That's not what causes all of our pain, although that does also cause a lot of our pain. But a lot of our pain is caused by things that are not illusory, that are actually happening. But our suffering, our true unhappiness, dissatisfaction, discontent, separation, and all that is being caused by a tendency that we all were conditioned to have, to believe in, to create this self and believe in it. That's what conditioned mind is. Conditioned mind is the thing that's making that happen all the time. And it has to be made all the time because that illusion is an illusion, and so it has to be continually created moment by moment. So conditioned mind is the process by which that illusion is created moment by moment inside our own mind. Okay, so that's enough about that. I've talked about that endlessly in other places. Okay, so back to the question. Is that thing, conditioned mind, a real thing? Or is that also an illusion? And the answer I'm going to propose, and just a little qualifier before I propose it, this is an ongoing process for me, actually. There was a certain way I was taught to look at conditioned mind at the monastery, and much of that way remains intact for me. But since I left the monastery, it's been, how long has it been? 6.5 years, something like that? Getting to be a good chunk of time since I left the monastery. There's been some evolution for me in my understanding of this stuff and the way I look at conditioned mind, and that evolution continues. So I'm going to articulate to you today how I see it currently, and just to know, don't hold me to it, because this is an evolving process. And part of the reason why this is an evolving process and has been of interest to me is because of the objections I've received from people, especially other Buddhists. Because when I left, and I'll get back to the proposal here in a second, but when I left the monastery, I talked about conditioned mind in almost exactly the way that I learned to speak of it at the monastery. And other Buddhists who practice in different ways, and what my teacher offered is pretty unique, even within Buddhist teachings or Buddhist communities. And so even the Buddhists who would run into the way of speaking about it would have objections, and sometimes vehement objections to the way of speaking about things. And so, of course, that caused me to look at it. The other thing that caused me to look at it was talking with other folks who had trained at the monastery, and what they had come to as they were able to look more for themselves at all this stuff after leaving the monastery. After they had accessed some kind of independence from the teachings that were offered at the monastery that allowed them to look at things for themselves. What had they come to? So that was also influential. So anyway, so that's part of what has driven this all along. So anyway, so what I would propose is that there's two different ways of looking at conditioned mind and talking about conditioned mind. And the question arises, is it one way or the other? And the answer is, it's both. That's what I'm going to propose in short form here, and then long form over the course of this podcast. It's not one or the other. It's both. And as another tangent, before I finally get to the proposal, a lot of things in life are like that. It's part of our conditioned mind to look at things dualistically and say, well, it's either one or the other. And if there is a logical incoherence between two different things, we feel like, well, those are two different things and can't possibly be simultaneously true. That is not the case from my perspective. Anyway, that's not the case. And many of you probably have heard me tell the story of when I first really got there, it was at the monastery. I was, for whatever reason, I was walking down the path towards the west end of the property one day. I think it was after the workday was done, and I had a little bit of free time, and was just considering this ancient question of, do we have free will, or is everything predetermined? And I was walking along just considering that, and I realized it's both. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. It's like, what they say, two sides of a coin. You look at a coin from one side, you see heads. You look at it from the other side, you see tails. But you're not seeing two different things. You're seeing one thing from two different points of view. And I suddenly realized that's the way it is with that old question. It is absolutely the case that there is free will, and it is absolutely the case that things are predetermined. It just depends on where you're looking from. Or to use another kind of analogy, you know how it is, I'm sure you've heard that in modern physics, one of the things that's so fascinating about modern physics is that people have realized that the observer has influence in whatever experiment you're doing. So depending on where the person is looking from, the outcome will be different. And we're talking about on the level of subatomic particles and all that. And I, admittedly, I don't know very much about this and don't really understand it, but that's my understanding of what people have gotten to. The observer has an influence on the outcome. It's kind of like that. So if depending on where you look at it, the reality changes. You have a certain reality if you look at it from one place. You have another reality if you look at it from another place. And a part of this thing that I'm going to propose today, if I can ever get to it, is that it is reality. So, well, I can't even say that really. It's one way to consider it is as if you're seeing reality, even though the two realities are distinct. So I'll come back to that later and try to explain that a bit. As opposed to both are illusory, which is also true. See, it's not one or the other. Even that is not one or the other. It's just that people tend to go to, well, they're both illusory, they're both made up. That is true, but it's also, you can also say that they are both reality. Or I also am not going to suggest that what we're talking about is some kind of compromise between two different points of view. I don't feel like it's a compromise. There are different ways to look at it, and depending on where you look at it, you have a different reality. And of course, that word reality has to be put into context, and that context is there's no such thing as objective reality, at least so far as we can understand that as human beings. Or maybe better to say, as we can experience it as human beings. We can't even say something like there is no objective reality, because that's an objective statement that we don't have, I don't think we have access to those kinds of objective statements. There's people who claim to have access to those by having transcendent experiences where they have escaped from a human perspective, and they see things and they say, well, I actually can see how things really are, because I have gone to this special place, this objective place. I don't know, maybe that's a thing, but that is certainly not something that I've experienced. So I would say, for sure, there's subjective experiences happening. Whether or not we have whether or not there is objective reality, I mean, theoretically, it seems like there has to be, but I don't actually know, and I don't really know if anybody else knows either. Okay, there goes another digression. Back to the question. So I want to outline two different ways of looking at conditioned mind. And my proposal is going to be, it's not either or, it's both, in the way that I was just saying. Okay, so let me say this. One perspective comes from being outside of conditioned mind looking at it. The other perspective comes from being inside conditioned mind looking at it. Okay? And let me give you the basic distinction, and then I'll try to fill it out and explain. If you are outside of conditioned mind looking at it, conditioned mind looks like a machine. It is something that has no life of its own, although it has energy, and it is accessing its energy from the life force of the person that it inhabits, you might say, kind of in the way that, like a machine, my favorite one is always a lawnmower. And the reason that's my favorite is because I've spent a lot of time in my life cutting grass. So it's a lawnmower. It's like a lawnmower. that lawnmower has energy, and the energy in the lawnmower comes from the gasoline that you put inside of it. Just like a lawnmower has, it's a bunch of different parts that have been designed and put together in such a way that it produces this certain product. And the product is this blade that's spinning that will cut grass if you push it around or if you drive it around. From this point of view, outside of conditioned mind, that's what conditioned mind looks like. It's like a machine. There's all these different parts, and a lot of what practice is, or let me say, the psychological part of practice. A lot of what the psychological part of practice is identifying all these different parts, seeing how all these parts work, how they fit together, how they do what they do, so that we can take apart the machine. That's a big chunk of what spiritual practice is. And when we get together in, the groups and, the classes and stuff, that's a lot of what we're talking about, because that's the stuff that you can talk about. The other part of practice is the more direct part, where it's the direct experience of present moment awareness. And there's not as much to talk about there. So conditioned mind from this outside point of view is like a machine. And the lawnmower, it has all these parts that come together to produce a certain result. In conditioned mind, it has these parts come together to produce a certain result. And that result is the illusion of a separate self, as I was saying before, and the suffering that comes from that. In a lawnmower, the gasoline provides the energy. In conditioned mind, our bodies, the life force that inhabits and is moving through our bodies, provides the fuel and the energy for conditioned mind. Another image that works really well, I think, is that conditioned mind is like a parasite. And you think like mistletoe, or, a virus is a good one these days. It's something that is in some way attached to a host body or within a host body, and is using that host body to to siphon off energy to do its life processes. Now, in the case of conditioned mind, I don't think it doesn't. Whether it's a real thing or not is debatable. Whether or not it's alive, I don't think is debatable, because it doesn't have a body. I actually don't know, but I think there's a debate that goes on about whether a virus is actually alive for similar reasons. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, if anybody knows about that, let me know, because I'm curious. But anyway, I feel like, at least in terms of conditioned mind, I don't think there's really much of a debate about whether it's alive or not. The debate is more about whether it's real or not, because conditioned mind doesn't have a body. Okay, so that's what it looks like from outside of it. So from inside of it, what does it look like? Well, from inside conditioned mind, and when I say inside, what I mean is basically believing in it. The way conditioned mind functions that it. Now, I'm going to talk about this in a way that implies agency. Okay, so just beware of that. But conditioned mind is talking to us all the time. It's talking us into a reality, into a fiction that we're the central character of. That's what that self is. We're sort of the character of a story that conditioned mind is telling us. Just for kicks, let me see if I can say that in a way that does not imply agency. So this would be the way of saying that from outside of it. There are conditioned thoughts that arise in response to certain stimuli, certain circumstances. Those thoughts were conditioned to associate with certain circumstances as the result of the training that we received as children. Those thoughts have a certain design principle inherited within them, as all processes do. All processes go from one place to another. And the design principle within those thoughts, those collection of thoughts, the unconscious allowing of those thoughts, maybe we could say, is the illusion of a self that is separate from life. So maybe, I don't know if that's useful to you. That's a way of articulating the same point from those two different points of view. So anyway, from inside conditioned mind, believing in the story that conditioned mind is telling, believing that the mechanisms, these are the different parts that I was talking about, like the lawnmower parts, the different mechanisms are true and real. And of course people believe that to the extent that they can't see that that's happening. They can't see them as parts. They just see them as reality. Like these are just real things that I'm thinking and experiencing. The result of being inside conditioned mind, believing it, is that conditioned mind looks like somebody who's out to get me, basically. It looks like an entity. It looks like it's alive. It looks like it has a will, and it has an agenda, and the agenda is to cause me to suffer. And that is basically working full-time, all the time, waking and sleeping, whether I'm waking or sleeping, to cause me to think that I'm somebody that I'm not, and to cause me to suffer. It looks like it is evil. It looks like it is malicious. And it looks like it is kind of like somebody's living inside my head, like somebody who's not me living inside my head. Okay, so that's the basic dichotomy. Those are the two different ways of looking at it that I see. So let's unpack them even a little bit more so that we can understand those two different points even a bit deeper. So going back to the first one is basically a mechanistic, materialistic kind of, or maybe let's say scientific way of looking at things. And this goes back to, I think was it the last podcast I did that was on the evolutionary origins of conditioned mind? This goes back to that. So from that point of view, you can look at us humans, as an organism, and this is on the side of that everything is determined, more on the side of free will, okay? You can look at us as an organism, and every other organism, for that matter, critters, plants, all that, as purely evolutionary developments that are pre-programmed to respond to certain things in ways that help them to survive. So, and I'm sure I don't have to explain that. That's basically what Darwin said, and that's basically the scientific orientation to biology, as far as I can understand it. And I don't understand that very much. I'm, the opposite of a biologist. I'm just someone who enjoys nature. But that's the way. That seems to me like the scientific orientation, according to what I understand it. And if there's more subtleties in that, somebody tell me, okay? Because I would really like to know. And so, from that point of view, as a human, all of our responses are pre-programmed by evolution in a way. Even, and stuff like, really obvious ones like, I have pain receptacles in my skin and in my body. So if I touch like a hot stove, I will instantaneously feel that and experience that, and that tells me, get your hand off the stove. Although it doesn't tell it in language, it tells it more instantaneously like that. There's an instantaneous response from the sensation to an automated response to pull my hand back. That's, for example. Then there's more subtle ones. For example, like our emotions. This is really interesting. I was reading something, or actually my friend Kathleen was reading it to me she's reading from a book about this. And it was a Buddhist fellow, was talking about this, and he was talking about our emotions. And it's interesting to consider those in the same way. Like a fairly obvious example is like anger. Well, what is anger? Well, anger is this, from this point of view, automated response that arises when we're not getting what we want. When what's happening is not conducive to our survival, let's say. Now, to say it that way, boy, it's hard to talk about stuff without going into these digressions, because everything has to be explained by everything else. But so forgive another little digression, but in order to be able to say that, and for that to be true, you have to ignore the influence of conditioned mind. Because with everything, there are natural responses, and then there are artificial ones. And when I say artificial, what I mean is ones that are caused by conditioned mind. So, for example, a person could, and this is happening probably more than the natural ones for just about everybody, because just about everybody is stuck inside conditioned mind just about all the time. There are experiences of anger that are completely artificial, and we all know those. I actually had one of those recently where I was experiencing some anger towards my friend Kathleen, and I was projecting stuff onto her that wasn't there. Conditioned mind, in other words, was telling me stuff that she was doing, and it was particularly telling me stuff about her motivations that turned out, after I investigated and asked her about it and got to the bottom of it, turned out to be completely untrue. And so there's artificial experience of anger that was happening. So, and again, that's a big part of what spiritual practice is seeing the illusory nature of the reality that gets created within conditioned mind and seeing the mechanism. So I'm talking now from the first point of view, from the mechanistic point of view, seeing into the mechanisms that are causing the illusion and letting those things go. So, in this case, letting the thoughts go that are causing this unfounded experience of anger. Okay, so there's that. So, but then, to say that an experience of anger is natural, we have to let out the conditioned mind part, let go of that, and cut that out of the equation. So a natural experience of anger is, somebody has, let's say, somebody maybe has cut me off in traffic. And there's this immediate, instantaneous rush of energy that we call anger. And we don't have to call it that. We can call it something else. But, we tend to call it that. There's this, and then that rush of energy is there to help us protect ourselves, because suddenly we're in danger. Somebody is threatening our life because they've just done something dangerous on the road. So like that would be a more natural one. And so, that's pre-programmed in the same way that our capacity to sense pain is. Well, here's another one I was looking at today that I found to be interesting. I got an email from somebody, and he was telling me that he's on vacation by himself in this lovely place and having a lovely time, but he's also a bit lonely. And I was looking at loneliness. Like, loneliness is an interesting thing. Like, what is that about? Is there any kind of evolutionary adaptation involved in that? And I think there is. If we speak of it without conditioned mind, with the conditioned mind part, conditioned mind is saying, well, you're a loser, you're no good, nobody likes you, and causes loneliness that way. And that's totally artificial. But if we leave out that part, we have learned to survive as a species by cooperation and living in community. It's essential to our survival. None of us can live separate from all other people. It's not possible. And so it's important for us to feel a desire and a need to be with others and to connect with others. And so from an evolutionary point of view, it seems to me like we could talk about loneliness as what happens when we are disconnecting ourselves from our community in some way. That threatens, on this really fundamental level, threatens our survival. Now, of course, my friend who's on this vacation, there's nothing about what he's doing that is threatening his survival. He's just checking out from his life and taking a break, and having some space, which is good. But from an evolutionary point of view, those distinctions are not there. It's just separate from, here comes the feeling that is designed to pull me back into a desire to connect with. So the point I'm driving at is that from this mechanistic scientific point of view, everything that we do, everything that we feel, everything that we think is predetermined by this evolutionary process that has produced a mind that will think in the way that it does, that will produce a body that will feel in the way that it does. And you might say also produce an energy system that will function, will flow in the way that it does. And part of what's interesting, here goes another digression, but part of what's interesting in terms of being a human is that perhaps uniquely, perhaps not, maybe there's some other animals who can do this to a certain extent, but we can choose to act outside of that evolutionary programming. For example, somebody who risks their life to save a child, puts their own life in danger to save somebody else. Completely contrary to our evolutionary programming. And actually, that's an interesting one. This just popped in my head because, mother bears, mother anybody's will do that all the time. So that's interesting because there's a way that's programmed in too. So maybe that's not such a good example. Here's maybe a better example of that. Somebody is willing to die for a cause. I heard something recently about early Christians who felt, were taught, believed, within their belief system that there is only one God and it's a sin to worship any other God. And these early Christians lived within this context where this is within the Roman Empire. And a part of being a Roman at that time was you had to worship the emperor because the emperor was seen as sort of semi-divine. And they wouldn't do it. They refused. And they were burned at the stake and fed to the lions and all this kind of stuff. So, that's completely And as an aside, it was interesting. The Romans didn't particularly want them to do that. They often there was this letter that boy, this is a digression, but forgive me. This is interesting to me. There's a letter that they found from, I can't remember what emperor it was, to the Christians saying, look, we all know this is baloney, but just for the order of the empire, we kind of have to ask of the city. You should just pretend. Can we all just agree that we're just pretending, and then you can keep your integrity and we can keep our system and all this stuff. And the Christians were like, nope. And so the Romans kind of had no force but throw them to the lions. So anyway, so there's a way that we have to bypass this evolutionary programming, which is absolutely fascinating, that we have that ability. So anyway, so there's the mechanistic point of view. So everything in a sense is predetermined. And that includes conditioned mind, because conditioned mind is a part of our evolutionary survival pattern. And if you are curious about more about that part of it, I'm not going to go into this right now because I feel like I'll be wasting your time, because there's another podcast that I just did that talks more about that. So, but anyway, so let's just take it for granted for the sake of this podcast that conditioned mind is an evolutionary adaptation that has enabled us to get to the point where we absolutely dominate this planet, and to such an extent that it seems to me, very likely are going to poison our environment, perhaps annihilate ourselves, because we have adapted to that extent so well that we have the power to annihilate ourselves. So anyway, so there's the mechanistic point of view. Okay, now, so a bit more about the point of view that says conditioned mind is a thing. It is a real thing that has a will and has intention and that kind of thing. So, from within inside conditioned mind, it looks like conditioned mind is doing stuff. And the reason it looks like that is because, when somebody starts doing practice, if they start doing practice with me and we start talking about things in this way, they'll start looking for that, and they'll see that there's stuff happening in my mind that I'm not choosing. As a matter of fact, much of what is happening in my life, perhaps most or even really close to all of what's happening in my mind, is not of my choosing. And of course, from a mechanistic point of view, that's because it's pre-programmed. But from this other point of view, what it looks like is there's something in my mind that is choosing it for me with a very specific intention. For example, this is kind of an extreme example, but it's the most, it's a useful one, I think. So there's this function within conditioned mind that we call self-hatred. And I'm going to talk a little bit more probably at the end of this podcast about that phrasing, because I want to unpack that a little bit too. But for now, there's this thing we call self-hatred. Self-hatred is the process by which we are made to feel bad about ourselves. Self-judgment, self-criticism, self-doubt, those different kinds of things, that the function within conditioned mind, and this is from the mechanistic point of view that I'm talking now, from the function within conditioned mind of this thing that we call self-hatred, it's what we talk about, we say we're beating ourselves up. The function of that is to create a sense of self-consciousness so that our attention is on us. I'll talk about it as me. My intention is on me and what's wrong with me, how I'm screwing this up or screwing that up, or how I shouldn't have done that, or everybody hates me, or whatever, that kind of stuff. So that my attention and awareness will be absorbed in this kind of blind self-consciousness so that I won't catch on to what conditioned mind is doing. And again, from the mechanistic point of view, it's important that I not catch on to what conditioned mind is doing, because it requires my blind allegiance, because it's a survival system. If I start to question this from the mechanistic point of view, if I start to question this survival mechanism, the survival mechanism ceases to function so well because I'm interfering with it. I need to just go with it. Something happens and here comes the conditioned response. From the mechanistic point of view and the point of view of our survival system, I need to not say, well, what is this response? Where is this coming from? I need to just do the response, because it's doing the response that helps me to survive. So that's the function of self-hate from the mechanistic point of view. From the other point of view, the conditioned mind has agency point of view. It looks like there's something within my mind that hates me, that wants me to fail, that wants me to feel bad about myself, that wants me to doubt myself, that wants to undermine any chances I have to be happy. And it looks like it is actively, what that thing that we call conditioned mind is actively working to create those kinds of experiences for me. Well, here's another example that's similar but different. There's all kinds of processes that happen for people that we might call self-sabotage. Boy, I'm tempted to tell you, I'm not going to, it's too long, but I've got a great story about that, but I'll tell you another time. But so we'll do things, we're going along, everything's going great. Well, here's a shorter example. So at the monastery, I was taught to facilitate workshops and retreats. I was trained as a facilitator, in other words. And there would be like a week-long retreat. I'd totally put my heart into it, do as good a job as I could, probably a pretty good job, objectively speaking, to whatever extent there is an objectively speaking. And then at the very end of the retreat, it would be, Saturday morning or Sunday morning, whatever day the retreat ended, be the last group. There'd be something that happened. I would say something and then conditioned mind would jump in and tell me that I can't believe you said that. That was a terrible thing to say. Who do you think you are, or whatever. And then it would just erase the entire experience and all the goodness and everything that I had put into it. Total self-sabotage. Or, if you look at it from inside this conditioned mind as an agent point of view, conditioned mind sabotage. Like conditioned mind was ruining that experience for me. It was taking away the goodness of it. It was blocking my ability to receive from all that I had put into that experience and all that I had given and all the heart that I put into my facilitation and all of that. So there's stuff like that going on all the time. I'm sure if you look at your life, you can see that certainly happening in the past. If you've done a lot of spiritual practice, maybe it doesn't happen so much now. If you haven't done so much spiritual practice, I'd encourage you to look to see, because I bet you can see that kind of thing happening everywhere. Or just throw in things to just screw things up. And as far as you can tell, that's the only reason to throw it in. Here's another example. At the monastery, there was this, we had an off-the-grid power system. And one day, one of the circuit breakers became defective. I got a new one. I was given the assignment to fix this thing. And so I got the new one. I had to put it in there. And I didn't take the time to say, now, what does a person really need to do before they do this? What I needed to do is shut down the whole system and turn off all the circuit breakers so that the power wasn't flowing. But I didn't do that because conditioned mind said to me in my own voice, in my head, saying, I know what I'm doing. I don't need to do that. And so I didn't look up to see what I needed to do, so I didn't do it. And so as I tried to replace a circuit breaker, I caused a short that blew up a larger part of the power system. Total self-sabotage. And what did I get from that? Well, I got to beat myself up. I got to have the self-hate. So that kind of stuff is going on all the time with people who are involved in conditioned mind. And so if you look at this from the conditioned mind as an entity point of view, it looks like conditioned mind is doing that to me. I'm doing my very best. And I would say that in regards to both the facilitation and my attempts to fix the power system. I'm doing my very best to do a good job. I'm so sincere, so trying to do the right thing. And then there's this other thing that comes up in my mind that is actively undermining my sense of confidence and my sense of adequacy, and is screwing things up to make me feel bad about myself. Happening all the time. And so from within this conditioned mind as an entity point of view, it looks like what life is, or what spiritual practice is a ongoing and perhaps perpetual process of fighting with conditioned mind. Telling it to stop, telling it to go away, seeing what it does. become, because it's operating in the shadows, of course, and bring it into the light of day, seeing it, what it does, how it does what it does, so that I can be stronger and more aware than it is, and it's not really aware, but just as a matter of speaking, so that I can defeat it and end its influence over me. Okay, so that's all I can think of to say right now about that way of looking at conditioned mind. So do you see? So there's two, and do you see how they're really the same thing? They're really the same thing, but they're really different too. Okay, so why is this important? The reason I feel like it's important is because, in general, seems to me, I have observed, people have very little difficulty with the mechanistic scientific point of view, and a lot of difficulty with the conditioned mind as an entity point of view. Even, as I said, maybe even especially Buddhist folks have trouble with that. And if a person only is willing to look at what's happening inside their minds from a mechanistic scientific point of view, there's something really important, I feel like, that's lost. And there's a trap that people can fall into. So I'm articulating this partly to explain and kind of defend the approach that I take with people, which includes both. I talk about conditioned mind from both points of view. And it really depends on the needs of the person I'm talking with. Often, in my experience, people at the beginning of practice really benefit from the conditioned mind as an entity thing. And for a long time afterwards, too, not just at the beginning. Over time, a person needs to let that go. And I'll talk about more of that in a bit. They need to be able to let go of that point of view and see it from the other point of view. But it's super helpful. But if a person doesn't have that point of view, then they potentially, not essentially, because a person can get to the same place just looking at things from a mechanistic point of view, but potentially lose something really important or make it a lot harder on themselves. So there's a danger and an advantage to both points of view. So for the mechanistic scientific point of view, the advantage is that it makes it so that I don't have to take it personally. I don't have to assume that all of this stuff is happening in reality to me. In other words, it's really helpful to see these kind of processes as something that's happening as a result of our environment and an evolutionary process, because I can see, well, that's not me doing it. This is something way bigger than me that is just happening to me. The disadvantage is that a person can create a place to be in relationship to that in which they don't fully disidentify from a self. And I feel like I see this happening with Buddhists sometimes, where, I don't know if I can explain this very well, but they're doing practice, but it's like there's an identity that's doing practice. I'm doing this. I'm seeing this, and in this way, even though this is kind of the opposite of what I was just saying, like this stuff is happening to me. It is happening from something that's outside of me, but it's happening to me. And so what I do is I need to work on myself. I need to free myself. That kind of stuff. And the problem with that is it creates a self that needs to be freed, and it creates someone to do the work. It's a pretty subtle point. But anyway, I feel like I see that happening. Let me see if I can think of a way to explain that better. So there's a practice that I'm aware of that is, and it doesn't matter which one it is. I don't want to feel like I'm defaming anybody publicly. And it's a beautiful practice. It's a wonderful, good thing. And I participate sort of on the periphery just because I find it to be curious and interesting. And I've mentioned this before, but this practice doesn't involve any process work, really. It doesn't involve any looking into the nature of conditioned mind, which is another way of saying what I feel like is the danger. People who are not taking conditioned mind and looking at it as this thing over there, are not, in some ways, are not looking at process. They're looking at mechanics. So maybe that's a good way of explaining it too. But anyway, so this practice, they don't particularly look at process. They're looking more at how things work objectively. You might say, well, how does the mind work? But kind of objectively. Well, there's this mechanism and that's mechanism and that kind of thing. And it's really groovy, and people, I think, get a lot out of it. But it's when I watch what's happening in these kind of dialogues that are happening in these meetings and stuff, there's no attention being brought to the person and where the person is coming from as they're looking and as they're asking the question. For example, there was this one thing that I saw where there's kind of these question and answer things that happen in this practice, and a person came up with a question about karma. And they're concerned about their karma and afraid of their karma in different ways, or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the question was. And the teacher responded by answering their question about karma. And it was really interesting for me because of course, I'm a facilitator, so I'm tagging along, and I'm looking not just as someone who's kind of a student of this dialogue, but also as a facilitator, and it's coming up in my mind, like how I would respond to something like that. And one of the ways that, I wouldn't necessarily do this, but one of the options that comes up, if someone asks a question like that, is instead of answering the question, is say, well, who's asking? Because it was really obvious to me that the difficulty that was being caused was not anything that had to do with karma. It was this person was asking from a place of fear. This person was essentially in their head, from my perspective. They're in their head trying to figure out something because they're afraid of essentially, I can't remember what it was, but something along the lines of, not doing it right, being the wrong person, typical conditioned mind stuff. And so within a process-oriented practice, which is the second type, that's the conditioned mind is a thing type. It's a thing out there. That's really useful. And that's going to go take a person directly to the heart of their experience, and it's going to take them to the cause of the suffering that they're experiencing, directly to that, and to in a place of awareness of that. If the teacher answers the question about karma, there's going to be useful information probably in that people can apply. That seems legitimately so also. So I'm not saying that's not a good way of going about it. That's the more mechanistic way of looking at it. But the thing it doesn't do is take people to a place of awareness of their own process. So this is helping me articulate it actually as I'm speaking, because, so here's another way to talk about choice two. So I've been talking about it is the place where conditioned mind is seen as an entity. Another way of talking about it is the place where conditioned mind is seen as an independent thing, a thing of its own. Now, is it really of its own? No, we can't say it's really of its own because it's connected to everything too. It's a part of everything. It's a part of life just like everything else is. But it's useful to see it as a thing of its own. And so someone who has not been trained to look at it as a thing of its own is going to be looking at it instead as a piece of me. Like this is a piece of my mind. And that's going to make it really hard for a person to fully disidentify. To like fully take that thing that we call conditioned mind and put it over there where I can see it as something that's completely outside of what is natural and authentic to me. So that's what I see. I hope I articulated that in a way that is understandable. That, to me, is the danger that comes from that mechanistic scientific point of view. Now, what are the dangers to the conditioned mind as an independent thing or conditioned mind as an entity point of view? Well, the advantage is what I was just saying. It points to process. It allows a person, so I'll just talk about it as if it's me. It allows me to take all this gobbledygook that's happening in my mind. There's all this mass of conversation and these beliefs that are coming through and these projections and these identities and all that stuff. And these different coordinated processes where this happens, then this happens, then this happens that are going all the time, like those processes of self-sabotage. I could take all of that stuff from this point of view and put it out there, like put it in a basket kind of and call it something. I can call that conditioned mind. I can make that something that's separate from me, fully separate from me, and adopt this attitude that says that has nothing to do with me. There's nothing authentic or in it. There's nothing of me in it. It's like a parasite. It's all that is something that is using, as I said earlier, it's using my life force to create this reality that serves it. It causes itself to exist through time. That's really helpful. Because then I don't have to ask myself what's me and what's not me. I mean, that is the process I'm doing, is I'm asking myself what's me and what's not me. But I don't have to assume that any of it's me. And so as I practice awareness and I'm watching this stuff happening, as something arises that is coming from a conditioned place, is something that, for example, is something I've been taught to believe that's not true. Like, I'm a no good loser, to use a gross example, which is something I was taught. When something like that arises, I can take that, instead of treating it as like, well, that's something that I have to get over, which is what's going to happen more in that mechanistic point of view. I can take it and say, that is an unreal thing that's coming out of conditioned mind. That's conditioned mind talking to me. And I can go put it in the conditioned mind basket. Super helpful. Especially for people who are just trying to sort all this stuff out. Now later on, we have to integrate it again. And I have to see there really is no real distinction between conditioned mind and other things. That there is no set me that is separate from anything. And all of this is it's just stuff happening. It's just stuff happening in mind. And not to make that differentiation. Or to say the same thing in another way, eventually I'm going to need to get to a point where I don't see conditioned mind as a thing. Because the disadvantage to that point of view is I'll start to see conditioned mind as a real thing and believe it is an objectively real thing that it's out to get me. And that's a big problem too. Now again, it's useful to look at it that way. As long as I understand that's not reality, it's really useful to look at it that way because it helps me to see it for what it is. But if I get pulled into an idea that is a real thing, now I'm going to get trapped in a perpetual fight with conditioned mind, or struggle maybe with conditioned mind. And that's no good because from another place, it isn't a real thing. And if I'm stuck in a perpetual contest, struggle, fight with something that's not real, I'm going to be continually recreating it as if it is real in my mind, and it is always going to be a factor and an influence in my life. And what we're going for is to a place where it is no longer a thing. It no longer is there. I no longer am bringing it into my awareness by giving it attention. In the beginning, I can't help but have it in my awareness because I'm not aware of it. And so it is there. It has gotten into my mind past my awareness because I'm not aware of it. And so it's doing what it does in my mind. And so from that point of view, it's already there. So I need to be aware of it and I need to call it a thing. But to the extent to which I'm free of the illusion of it, I don't want it there. I don't want it there in my mind. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a slightly different way in just a moment. So anyway, the disadvantage is that I'm going to create this thing as a real thing, and I'm always going to be in a relationship with it, and that will continue to bring it into existence. Okay, and so now let's get back to our fundamental question. Is conditioned mind a real thing? Well, yes and no. It depends on where you're looking. If you're looking from from outside of it, no, it's not a real thing at all. It's just kind of a matter of convenience. It's a process that's been developed over time to help us to survive. From the other point of view, it is a real thing. It's a real, it has a power over me if I'm inside it, as if it is a real thing. It is, and that's our experience, isn't it? Isn't that your experience if you're identified with conditioned mind? It has real power. It has a real influence. It can ruin my life. It can legitimately ruin my life if I believe in it. Okay, so let me throw in this other thing, and I'm going to get way out here on a limb with this, but See what you think. I'm just throwing this in just for kicks. So we can easily say, in answer to the question, is either one of those ultimately a real thing? No. Is conditioned mind ultimately a real thing? No, it's not. But we can also say, can we really say that though? Because that's in a statement of objective reality. And like I said at the beginning, I don't feel like we have access to objective reality. So there's this crazy place where I could also say, well, I'm not going to say conditioned mind is a real thing, but I have to say I don't know whether or not it is a real thing. You know, and what we get, the way I get here is, like when I look at this thing, life with a capital L, I tend to project it's a real thing. And I also am aware that I don't know it's a real thing. And I also know that I can't know that if it's a real thing, but just kind of for convenience, because I like it, because I enjoy it, I tend to project and just talk about it as if it's a real thing. As if I'm a theist, basically. I often joke that I'm a closet theist. And because Buddhists aren't supposed to be theists. But anyway, I enjoy being a theist. It's fun, you know, because, you know, when I look at this thing that I call life, like what are its attributes? Well, it's loving, it's kind, it's compassionate. It seems like it's always giving me exactly what I need, exactly at the moment when I need it. Even stuff I don't want and don't like. Even that stuff is exactly what I want and what I need. It feels like it absolutely loves me, that it wants me to perfectly succeed in this life and to have the deepest, fullest, richest, best possible life ever. It's really how it seems. Now, from the mechanistic point of view, that's crazy. You know, like, why would we want to deify or to reify this thing like that? Well, I don't know. We certainly don't need to. We can look at it from a mechanistic point of view, but I like it. I like it. It's fun. But you know, if I assume that really is reality, then of course I get into trouble, because I get into the kind of trouble that Christians have gotten into trouble with over time. Where now it's exactly the same as what I was talking about in relationship to conditioned mind, because now they've got this real thing they're relating to, and then they start to project their conditioning onto it. Isn't that what's happened to Christianity over time? Is now we have this vengeful God, this judging, vengeful God that is watching me to see if I'm doing it right or doing it wrong, and is punishing me and rewarding me. That's pure conditioned mind stuff. You know, so, you know, I wouldn't want to do that with it, but, you know, as long as I'm not doing that with it, it's kind of fun, and I enjoy it, and I like it. I like to walk around in life feeling like I'm loved and cared for all the time, and that everything is working to my good. Well, if I'm going to do that, I feel like I can do that with conditioned mind too. You know, that I can reify or sort of deify it also. And so, you know, when I look at life, can I really say it's not that? No, I can't. I can't say that I know it's not this thing that is beyond my comprehension, that is acting in the way that it's acting. I don't feel like I can say that, because I don't know that. I don't have the perspective of divinity to be able to say that. Same thing with conditioned mind. Can I actually say I know it's not a real entity? No, I don't think I can. And so this is relatively unimportant, but it's just interesting to consider, because that leaves a door open to something that's going on beyond this mechanistic worldview that we look at. You know, look at things through. From the mechanistic point of view, it's really comfortable to say, no, of course not. Of course it's not. There's not a real thing. It makes people super uncomfortable to leave open a doorway to, well, how do you know? Maybe there is such a thing as a God. Maybe there are such things as gods, like gods that live inside trees and rivers and stuff, like, you know, like pantheists would assume. Makes people really uncomfortable. So anyway, that's just something easy or interesting to consider. Okay, so I'm running out of time, but I want to throw in one more thing. I'll let you go. I'm going to have to let the self-hatred thing go. I promised earlier I was going to unpack that a little bit, but I don't want to make this podcast too long. I'll do that another time. But the same kind of thing applies, is whether or not that's real or not real, and what to call it and that kind of thing. So I'll unpack that another time. But one thing I do want to say, one more thing I want to say is just like, okay, given everything that I've said in this podcast, how should we live our lives? Let's just look at that for a second. So here's how I see it. If a person is new to practice, I would recommend that always both points of view are a part of things. The mechanistic point of view and the conditioned mind is an independent thing or an independent entity kind of point of view. To have both of those there, but someone who's new to practice, I think is really helpful to enthusiastically adopt this conditioned mind as a thing over there point of view, because it's just super helpful. It just helps to divide things up, helps to get clear about things, helps to get clear about what's what. At the time when that ceases to become useful and appropriate, and I would say for me that began to happen maybe, I don't know what you're going to think about this, but 20 years in, something like that. And again, the other one has always been there too, but it's really been since leaving the monastery, which actually makes it later than 20. It makes it 20-some years in. But where I've really I started off more in the mechanistic point of view and more in the just direct experience of awareness place. And then what was advantageous about my monastic experience, one of the many things, is it taught me this process work. And it taught me how to be in this other place where we're looking at conditioned mind as an entity. It really hasn't been so much, but since I left the monastery, that I've really kind of headed in the other direction. And right now, I'm headed very much in the direction of away from looking at things as conditioned mind is over there to an integration and looking at life as all of one, all one thing, and where there's no differentiation, where there's no duality, there's no here or there. So anyway, at some point, and I'm sure the time that this is appropriate is different for different people. I'm kind of a slow learner, I think, in these areas, or either that or I'm just very thorough. I'm not sure which, maybe both. But for me, that was useful for a long time to look at conditioned mind that way. But I'm moving away from that. And where I am now is here's what I feel like, at least as far as I'm aware, this is the place I want to live and practice from instead. Where I want my attention to be, if I'm not suffering, is to be here in the moment, experiencing the goodness and the beauty and the harmony and the love that's here in the present moment. Those are all projections, but anyway, that's how I experience them. I don't want to be looking for conditioned mind, because if I'm here, and I'm just here in the moment, and I say, well, what's conditioned mind up to? Then conditioned mind will suddenly be there, even if it wasn't there the moment before. I don't want to do that. I don't want conditioned mind to be here. I want to live in absolute 100% complete freedom from conditioned mind to the extent that that's possible for me. And as I always say, that's a work in progress. I don't want it around. I don't want to have anything to do with it. So if I'm just going along and I'm at peace, then I just want to stay at peace. And the way to stay at peace is I want to have my attention here in the moment. However, if conditioned mind has slipped through and past my awareness, kind of past the gatekeeper at the guardian of my consciousness, and has gotten in and is banging around doing stuff, then I want to very much be aware of conditioned mind, and I want to look at it as an independent entity, because that's how I know to practice with it. And I'm going to get out my tools, and I'm going to look at, what's the conversation, what's the belief system, and what am I projecting, what are the identities that are here, what are the processes, what's real and true, and what's not real and true, and all the kind of things that we do in practice. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to isolate it, kind of like in a laboratory experiment. You know how in a lab you'll take something, and like a virus, let's say, and you'll isolate it so that you can see what it is. You take it apart from everything that's influencing it, so you can see just what it is in itself. That's what I want to be doing with a piece of conditioning that has gotten through and is in my mind involuntarily. And then I'm going to work with it until I see into its illusory nature, and it always will have an illusory nature, and let it go. And when I let it go, it will be gone, and it will disappear from my consciousness. And as soon as that happens, I want to bring my attention back to pure attention and awareness to the moment. I want to put away my tools. I want to stop looking at conditioned mind and thinking about conditioned mind. I just want to be here, because that's what this is really all about. So you see, I'm going to do the process work if I need to. I'm going to let it go if I can, if I don't need it. That to me that's the sweet spot, and that's what I'm practicing these days. So there you go. I hope that was interesting to you. I understand these things are complex, and then I'm giving a ton of very subtle and intricate kind of information in these kind of talks, especially this one today. So I hope you were able to absorb it, or absorb some of it. As always, if you have any feedback, I'm way open to it. I hope you found that to be interesting and useful, and I hope that you will continue to follow along and continue to receive from what I'm offering. And thank you for your practice. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for awareness. Thank you for being the person that you are in your authentic nature. Be well, and I'll look forward to talking with you again soon.